Hello and welcome back to another Signals to Danger Rail Safety Review. These are the episodes of the podcast where we look at current affairs in the world of railway safety, including a focus on the work of the Rail Accident Investigation Branch. Now, I'm not going to go into details, but I've had a fairly grim few weeks. I've said a little bit on Twitter, so some will be aware, but there's been some other stuff going on, and suffice to say, it's quite nice to be doing this again, if nothing else, purely for a distraction. My name is Dan Fox. I'm the producer of Signals to Danger and also a full-time employee within the ops team of a UK train operating company. As I always do, just quickly take a moment to thank those of you who've been coming out to support the podcast, either on Patreon or through donations or purchasing merchandise, especially now, after there has been some prolonged breaks in the podcast. I just want to remind you as well that if you do subscribe through the Patreon platform at any tier, you will be able to listen to episodes there ad-free. This week is a bit of a catch-up from all the current affairs that have been going on. So last episode and this episode, we're just going to blast through. But that does mean that today we have quite a bit to be talking about. This week on our Rail Safety Review, we will be talking about the safety digests that cover a train striking an object at King's Langley, the near miss with a track worker at Little Hempston, and we'll also be covering the full reports into trap and drag incidents on the London Underground, the unsafe movement of a train at Stile, a member of staff hit by a train at St Philip's Marsh Depot, Flying Scotsman's incident in the Highlands, and the Grand Central overspeed at Peterborough. Lots and lots to be getting on with. Introed yet again. Let's now get into the meat of the review for this week. No really beefy news from the REIB or indeed the wider industry since last time we were here, so in the interest of breaking the back on the backlog, let's dive straight into the safety digest that we still have to discuss. Digest number 1 then takes us to King's Langley and a bit of a familiar sounding problem which we've seen some other times recently. About 6:43 in the morning on the 25th of April this year, a train travelling between Wolverhampton and London struck part of a temporary road rail access point which had been left on the track near to King's Langley on the West Coast Main Line. The temporary RAP being RRAP, had been used during the previous night as part of the work on the overhead line equipment. Sounds remarkably similar to an incident LNER experienced a few months back at Hydyke, but let's get into the detail on this one a little bit. It was slightly more dangerous an occurrence here by virtue of the location. Track ballast and debris from the collision not only shot up and hit another train that was passing through the same area, but also ended up on the platforms of King's Langley Station. Luckily, by virtue of the time, these were unoccupied when this took place. Nobody was injured, though the trains did receive enough damage to take them out of revenue service till they'd been repaired. The reason for this accident is, unsurprisingly, that part of a temporary RAP was unintentionally left on the track after an engineering possession was given up, incredibly similar to that other incident. It was another situation where a planned possession of the line was used to undertake work, in this case for OLE, overhead lines, and to undertake this work, 2 road rail vehicles, mobile elevated work platforms, were required. As such, they needed to be moved from the road onto the tracks, and this is a process that we do call on-tracking. On-tracking at King's Langley is not a particularly taxing experience, as the station is one of the places where permanent road rail access points have been installed. 1 on each of the 4 tracks, although the one on the up-fast has been removed. The first MEWP was on-tracked using the permanent RRAP on the down-fast line accessed from the western gate of the access point, and the second was supposed to be on-tracked on the up-fast, which was also accessed from the western gate. The plan that they were using to do this identified that that permanent access point was missing and stated that a temporary access point would be required to be installed on the up-fast. No specification within the plan what type of RRAP was to be used, just that one was required. Disappointingly, the plan didn't include any restrictions that would apply to its use or identify any risks associated with its use. As at Hydyke, a temporary RRAP was used which comprised of 4 separate kits made of high-density foam. Each kit included 2 ramp pieces for outside the rails and 3 pieces which created a platform in between them. On the night of the actual possession, the 11-strong team assembled at the access point and got on there just before midnight at 23:59. Only one of the platforms could initially be on track because the adjacent line to the other remained open, so it didn't leave sufficient space to get the second onto the up-fast line. So those team focused on getting the down-fast MEWP, which was on the permanent access point, sorted and on the move. Those members of the team who weren't involved in that then slogged across the 20 pieces of the access point to the right location in preparation for on-tracking the other vehicle, but they came up against a problem. The ballast there was too high, and without tools to dig it out, they resorted to, well, Mark 1 hands and Mark 1 feet, the most technical of tools. This meant that it's probable that the access point was higher than required, reducing the clearance above it. The MEWPs were eventually on-tracked and the work undertaken, though it does seem that part of the access point was dragged along the track by the MEWP itself due to the fact that there wasn't enough clearance above it. The team cracked on with their work unawares before they headed back to the access point at around about 0300. Now, when they returned, one of the MEWPs derailed on the temporary RRAP as it was being off-tracked. This is a story with a lot of abbreviations, isn't it? It's likely that was the result of that reduced clearance that we talked about. After the MEWP was inspected and confirmed to be undamaged, the machine controller moved sections of the disturbed point around to facilitate its re-railing. Once it was completed, it was off-tracked and removed from site. The team then scrabbled around in the darkness with head torches, removing the access point, but missed the displaced part about 40 metres away, and that remained on the up-fast line. No component counts, no checks were undertaken to make sure that all 20 pieces of the temporary point were removed, and that would have identified that one was in fact missing. This now means that after the line was handed back, 1 Romeo 00 and Avanti service, which was travelling at 124 miles an hour, approached this piece of track in the morning. The RRAP piece that had been left in between the rails of the line got trapped underneath the train, disturbing ballast, dislodging a brake pad, and the drivers first became aware of an issue when the train systems indicated a loss of electrical power. Staff further along the train also reported hearing a loud noise, which was followed by the deflation of one of the suspension airbags on the rearmost coach. 9 Sierra 44, also operated by Avanti West Coast, was travelling about 107 miles an hour in the opposite direction, and debris from underneath 1 Romeo 00 impacted that train, damaging its windscreen. No specific learning points for this one, but some flags back to previous incidents, including High Dyke, which we have covered relatively recently. This last digest that we're going to go through is a relatively quick one, and it's very similar to a lot of others we've spoken about and covers something we see an awful lot at the moment, and that is a near miss with a track worker. Genuinely, I do say we see this an awful lot, but we have to bear in mind that people working on the line, especially when those lines are open, is probably one of the more dangerous jobs that is on the railway. So it's not unusual that we see a lot of instances involving this practice, but you have to ask the question as to whether or not there are trends in the way these roles are done that is leading to them being safety digests. Anyway, at around 10:44 in the morning on the 13th of March this year, a passenger train travelling at about 54 miles an hour was involved in a near miss with a track worker near Little Hempston, Devon, at around 1.5 miles north of Thomas Station. In this situation again, the member of staff in question was the COSS, the COSS, the Controller of Site Safety. We've seen a frustrating trend in these digests recently where the one person who's really holding the duty to make sure that people are safe are the ones involved in the incident, be that a PIC, a PICC, a person in charge, or a COSS, or a PICOP, person in charge of possession. Anyway, the group involved in the incident consisted of the COSS and 5 track operatives, all of whom had been provided by Pace Infrastructure Solutions to Colas Rail. The COSS was the person in charge, the PIC for the work being taken. PIC is responsible for all aspects of safety while the team is on the track. The group had been working on signal troughing, those channels you see along the side of the track, and working in a separated system of work which is a method of work which requires them to remain at least 2 meters from any running line. Not going to go too deeply into this one as it's not overly complicated, but let's have a little detail on the background. So, in September of 2023, Colas had identified that these works should be completed using possessions or during line blocks, both being periods where there are no trains running. However, as Colas had been unable to get these midweek possessions in the area, the works were planned to be delivered using the separated systems of work, while both railway lines remained open to traffic. This plan also included a system of work in which the COS would obtain line blockages for a short duration to allow people to get round structures with limited clearance. Now, the expectation here was that the COS would stop work if the group needed to get within 2 meters of the line at any point. To remain safe and understanding sounds like a sound plan. The group reached the site and work started as planned, with the group checking and replacing any loose troughing lids on the cable route, and they worked along the troughing, moving from north to south. The COS stated that as the work progressed, they noticed that the distance between the troughing and the running rail was becoming smaller. The COS instructed the group to stand down in an area that had a greater than 2 meters separation, and then they went further to the south, to check if the group could continue to work under this separated system of work. Despite the separation distance narrowing, the COS continued along the CES as they moved south. This moved them close to the CES rail of the up main line, to the point that they eventually became at risk of being hit by a passing train. As the COS was now remote from the group, there was no one present to challenge or warn them that they were now too close to the open line, and measurements undertaken after the incident by Network Rail showed that the distance between the troughing and the nearest rail at this location was less than 2 meters. At this point, when the COS was in a position of real risk, a train approached. At 54 miles an hour on an open line, coming round a corner which was obscured by vegetation, so as you'd expect, the driver hit the horn, and the COS ended up clear of the line with 2 seconds to spare. Following this near miss, there was a disagreement of opinion as to whether one had actually taken place, with the driver being fairly confident that a near miss had happened and the COS not believing that one had taken place. In fact, they stated that they'd only realised that they'd been involved in a near miss when the driver of another train passing afterwards stopped and asked them to contact the signaller using a signal post telephone. The signaller had been unable to contact the COS directly due to poor mobile phone reception at the site, and because the COS did not have with them the portable GSMR, the radio, the Global System for Mobile Communication - Railway, if we're being technical, phone that they had been issued with. So this Safety Digest then ends with a reflection on similar incidents, as most do, and points readers to a recently published summary of learnings on protecting track workers from passing trains. For those of you who've been listening to this podcast for some time, you'll be aware that me telling you that I was feeling a bit under the weather and my throat and nose and everything wasn't working properly was somewhat of a regular occurrence. Not one to let traditions die, so you might hear that my voice is a little bit different today, and I'm a little bit more breathy than usual. So I'm going to do my damnedest to clean this up in post-production and try and get rid of all the breath sounds, but in case I don't manage it, wish me well and just focus on the content. I'm trying my best, but I do want to get this out for you. I am now going to try and wrap up the leftovers from the reports of this episode, and it's going to be a big push because there's actually now 5 of them. That pesky RAIB does keep issuing them. As ever, it's probably going to be something of a canter through, so please go and read the fuller report for full details, because I'm not going to be able to give it the same justice a full episode devoted to each would do in this. So, starting then with 2 incidents which took place on the northern line of the London Underground in close succession at the start of last year. In the first, on the 18th of February, a passenger became trapped in the door of a Northern Line train at Archway Station. They were exiting the train using a single leaf door when the door began to close on them and their coat became trapped. Train departed, and the passenger was dragged for about 2 meters along the platform before falling to the ground, and the coat became free of the door. The passenger's companion, who was holding onto them at the time, also fell to the ground, and the train travelled approximately 20 metres until it stopped after the operator became aware of the passenger being trapped. This passenger sustained serious injuries, and their companion was happily uninjured. In the second incident, on the 20th of April, a passenger's coach became trapped in the doors of a Northern Line service at Chalk Farm Station. This passenger had attempted to board the train but stopped because the doors were closing. The doors closed while the passenger was still close to the train, however, trapping their coach. The train then departed, dragging them along the platform. The train travelled for approximately 20 metres until the coach became free and the passenger fell to the ground. The train operator was unaware of the accident and continued the journey, and the passenger sustained minor physical injuries to the left elbow, both knees, and psychological distress, which I can't say I particularly blame them for. These incidents, we call them trap and drags for very descriptive reasons, but they are probably one of the most dangerous incidents that can happen on the PTI, the platform train interface. At that point where the soft, mushy people are really closely interacting with the big, heavy, metal, solid things. Looking first at the events at Archway, then, the on-train data recorder shows it. Train stopped at Archway Station at about 15:49. Train operator opened the passenger doors using the buttons in the cab 2 seconds after the train had stopped. 4 seconds after they were completely open, the train operator initiated the doors closing sequence using the close push buttons in the driving cab. This sequence takes about 5 seconds. For the first 2 seconds, a door chime sounds. We've all heard it before. And then the doors begin to close. It takes about 3 seconds after that, so 5 seconds end to end. The train doors had remained completely open for only 6 seconds before they began to close. Comparison of CCTV and on-train data recorders, OTDRs, shows that at the point the doors close buttons were operated, the companion was visible in the doorway exiting the train. The passenger was still alighting from the train when the door closed on them. They managed to pull themselves free. Their arm did get caught momentarily, but the coat that they were wearing became trapped in the door. The passenger and the companion both realised, tried to pull it free, but they couldn't do that. They did believe that the train operator would be able to see them and would open the doors to release the coat, which clearly didn't take place. The operator was aware that the passenger and their companion were close to the train, but not aware that the passenger's coat was trapped in the closing doors. Believing it was safe to do so, they commanded the train to depart, and of course, as the train departed, the passenger and companion were dragged along the platform. The companion seemed to try and hold on to the passenger to provide them some protection, because the person who was injured was, by the way, 101 years of age, which is definitely a point where you're probably trying to limit the amount of injuries that you sustain. The combined weight of the passenger and the companion did actually pull the coat free of the doors. Train operator who was watching the in-cab CCTV monitor said that they saw the passenger fall, made an emergency brake application to stop the train. Looking at the Chalk Farm incident, the train entered the southbound platform at around 23:03. Passenger doors opened. 6 seconds later, this passenger is visible on the CCTV footage entering the platform from the stairway at the very rear of the train. They arrived on the platform, attempted to board the train, but the doors were closing. Those door chimes would have been sounding. To their credit, the passenger realised that the doors were closing and stepped backwards on the platform, but then realised that their unzipped coat had become caught in the doors. They couldn't pull it free, and then the train started to depart. About 18 metres of this dragging, the zip separated from the passenger's coat, and then the coat was then pulled through the edges of the door as the passenger fell to the ground. In this case, though, the train operator was unaware that the passenger had been dragged, so continued out of the platform and on to the next station. And in fact, that train operator wasn't made aware that anything had happened until they booked on shift for their next shift 5 days later. In somewhat of a surprising twist, neither of these incidents were reported to the RAIB, and in both cases the trains were tested to make sure that they were operating as expected. Immediate cause then for the Archway one is, unsurprisingly, the passenger was trapped while alighting and dragged along the platform. The causal factors, fairly what we might expect. Firstly, that the passenger's coat became trapped in the closing door and was not released before the train started to move. The door opening period, it wasn't really long enough for the companion and the passenger to alight the doors. I imagine they weren't moving particularly quickly, but it was in line with dwell times at the station that was set by the management centre, and as the operator was prompted to start closing them by the systems on the train. As it stands, as the door close button was pressed, the companion had alighted, but the passenger who got trapped hadn't yet got off. They were waiting for assistance from their companion. Although the train operator was unaware of the presence of the passenger when they decided to close the doors, they had seen the companion getting off the train. The operator believed that that companion was clear of the doors and therefore safe to close them. Although you could say that that companion was close to the train when this decision was taken, the train operator may have believed that by the time the closing sequence had started, which takes about 5 seconds from the doors being commanded to shut, that companion would be completely clear of the doors. Train operator was unaware that the companion was waiting, like I said, to assist the passenger off. The door didn't detect the trapped coat in this case, partially because there's no real edge protection, as we see on some more modern stocks. There's no real edge detection, not protection. And a lot of modern train doors, you'll see those rubber strips on the edge of the door, and quite often there is a system built into them which is meant to detect items that are trapped by the doors. The actual doors themselves have a system which can detect trapped objects, but it's limited to items about 11 millimeters. Because the coat was quilted, it would have been compressed down to that size. The passenger and the companion didn't really have a lot of time to free the item either before that train started moving. Helpful fact for you all, though, if you do get something stuck in the tube doors, according to this report, one door in each of the double sets and each single door can be pushed back 115 millimeters against a spring for the exact purpose of releasing stuff that is trapped. The last significant causal factor for this part of it is the operator was unaware of the trapping. So the train operator was monitoring the platform train interface through the CCTV monitors, but he was aware of the presence of the companion and the passenger, and being aware that the passenger had been initially caught her arm in that closing door as they alighted. I say her arm, I do apologise, their arm, very gender neutral report as always. However, the train operator believed that the passenger had pulled themselves free and stated that they had allowed additional time for them to do this. They weren't aware that the coat had been trapped in the door, and the OTDR data shows that there were approximately 11 seconds between the door closed button being pressed and the train starting to move. Very, very quick. Well, we've all been on the underground, we all know how swiftly things move along. The train operator stated that in carrying out a check of the platform as the train departed, they realised there had been an accident and stopped the train. And moving back across to Chalk Farm, I know it's very left and right here and there, we're seeing similar factors raised with an almost identical immediate cause. There is a departure in the fact that this was a late running passenger who wouldn't have been present on the platform during the departure checks, and at the point the command to close the doors was given. Also, in this case, that passenger was very, very at the back of the fields that were visible on the CCTV, and it's possible that the check wasn't effective because that passenger was difficult to detect on the monitors. RAIB observed that they weren't really conspicuous against any platform background at the very, very rear, and they were wearing dark clothing which didn't stand out from their surrounding environment. The RAIB did do a reconstruction which placed the person in the similar position, similar outfit, without other passengers obscuring them, and viewed this person from the in-cab monitor on the trains and demonstrated that it was difficult to identify a person. Now, in addition to all these factors, probably fair to say there might have been an element of haste. The train start command was given 1 second after the door interlock light illuminated, which is not an overly long amount of time to conduct a final check. And these reports, they are full reports, they're very detailed, there's lots of stuff in there that I'm just not going to be able to cover off in this type of episode, but one factor which I found particularly interesting, and an unusual one that we don't really talk about all that often, is underload. Underload is the opposite condition to overload, and it's used to describe situations where people will experience really low workload and be doing repetitive tasks, which can result in sort of an automatic mode of responding. I think we've all done one of those jobs when we're growing up. Maybe it's stacking cans of beans on a shelf, it's folding up newspapers and putting them in a bag. It's those tasks that don't really require a lot of effort from you. And the brain just switches off a little bit, does it automatically. So during the time when you are undertaking a job that provides underload, attentional resources may be withdrawn, and that's the wording that's used in the report, because of the routine nature of the task. When there's low task-related activity, alertness is also reduced, and that leads to this cognitive underload. A situation such as this might be when a train operator is driving, in inverted commas, in a place where the train and line-side systems control the train itself, except in stations, which remain the responsibility of train operators. Between stations, the train operator's task on the Northern Line is mainly monitoring in-cab displays, looking for obstructions on the line ahead of the train, and that's under ATO or automatic train operation. Really, not a lot of effort, I suppose. Have to have your attention, monitoring systems, things like that. But in terms of controlling the brake, controlling the speed, checking this, checking that, it's a bit more hands-off. Maybe not physically, but mentally it's a bit more hands-off than some other driving situations. Like stations, which in contrast to that, require a really high level of attention and vigilance, and difficulties can arise when you're making the switch between levels of activity. When people experience cognitive underload, it can lead to faster reaction times, but reduced attention and more errors. For both the operators involved in the instance in this report, the time spent in stations was short overall, which suggests this might have been a result of their actions becoming automatic. Couple all that with each of the cabs having a countdown timer in them, saying when you need to leave, and it's a reinforcement of that need to hit the timetable, which might result in some rushing. There are a lot of other factors highlighted around risk assessments, etc., but I'm not going to go into detail. Far too much to be getting on with this episode. And there were some comments, though, that were made about the interaction with the RAIB, starting with the fact the incidents weren't reported. We have done a little bit about this in the past, what is reportable to the RAIB and what isn't reportable. Although LUL, or London Underground Limited, notified the ORR about the accidents, RAIB was not aware of them until 3 months after the incident at Archway and a month after the incident at Chalk Farm. LUL said it wasn't clear that these accidents were notifiable. Having said that, though, the incident at Archway resulted in a serious injury and should have been immediately reported to the RAIB. And while the accident at Chalk Farm didn't result in a serious physical injury, the regulations require that incidents that in slightly different circumstances could have led to serious injury or worse should be immediately notified. RAIB would therefore expect this to have been notified. And the guide about notifying accidents states that if there's any doubt, duty holders should notify the branch. Add into this that no details of the action plans implemented for the operators were available to RAIB. That means it's difficult for them to evaluate them and say whether they're appropriate or whether they cover the necessary learning from previous accidents. To top it all off, LUL didn't follow their own processes. They failed to test either operator for drugs and alcohol, even though the incidents met the criteria that was in their own standards. Few questions for LUL, I think, there. Recommendations then to close this one out. 4 in this case. Firstly, that LUL should review its processes for managing risk of for managing risks of trap and drag events on the Northern Line. Secondly, that they should identify and evaluate options that might reduce the risk of a passenger becoming dragged. This should include consideration of options such as technology which will detect when thin objects become trapped indoors, modifying door seals to make it easy for small trapped objects to be pulled free, using technology to detect when something is being dragged along by the train, and improving the images on in-cab monitors to enable drivers to see, whether someone's trapped. Thirdly, considering the sequence of events detailed in this investigation, London Underground Limited should review the current minimum automatic train operations safe station dwell times, which feels like a bit of a mouthful, to determine if passengers have sufficient time to safely alight or board trains. And finally, London Underground should review the environmental, organisational and job factors related to operating trains in ATO, automatic train operation mode, to understand how underload may affect train operators. And that's that. Let's move away now from underground trains to some northern heavy rail, perhaps unsurprisingly considering that link on a northern trains service up here in the north of England. Summary for this one then: at about 15:26 on the 3rd of May 2023, a passenger train operated by Northern Trains Limited departed from Styles Station in Manchester with 5 bodyside doors open. This was a Class 323 electric multiple unit, which has honestly got one of the best sounds of a departing electric multiple unit by a lot of people's estimation, but that's me getting a little bit too nerdy about trains. Immediately before the incident, the train had experienced technical difficulties, meaning the driver was unable to release the brakes and take power. As a result of this, Northern Trains Limited asked them to isolate safety systems to allow the train to move. This didn't resolve the issue, however, after further checks, the train became able to move, with some doors open. Clearly, trains on the move with open doors present something of a considerable risk to those on board, so let's do some digging into the report. Train in question is 323232, which is enormously satisfying to say, and at the time of the incident it had just worked a service from Manchester Piccadilly out to Crewe and was on the return journey back into the city. At Alderley Edge Station, once the dispatch process had been completed, the driver found they were unable to release the brakes, and the driver and conductor repeated the action of opening and closing and doing some initial fault finding, which just didn't resolve the issue. When in doubt, ask for help, and this is what the crew did, reaching out to the operator's maintenance controller based at Manchester Rock, the rail operating centre. The line was busy though, they couldn't get through, so they decided to just try opening and closing the doors one more time, followed the normal dispatch process, and they got brake release, and the train left the station after sitting there for 11 minutes and 40 seconds, considerably longer than the booked time. Running late then, train went on to Wilmslow, where the dispatch went without issue, and arrived at Style 18 minutes down on its booked time. It was on the departure from Style, just after 3 PM, that the issue resurfaced, and the driver could not get the brake release. The crew had a chat. The conductor was asked to contact the maintenance controller again, while the driver kept trying to fault find in the cab. For the first 8 minutes after the attempted departure, the driver remained in the front cab, talking the conductor through initial fault-finding actions while he was waiting to get through on the phone. At the same time, the driver continued to reset train systems in an attempt to resolve the brake release problem. During the course of this fault-finding, the train's doors were released, meaning that passengers could open doors using the control buttons just next to them. At about 9 minutes past 3, the conductor managed to get through to speak to the MC, the maintenance controller, and this call was made on his company-issued mobile phone. Due to poor phone signal, the conductor opened the local door, got off the train and continued the call from the platform. There was a number of questions asked to see what actions had already been done, what have you tried. The conductor, under the MC's instruction, then checked whether passenger alarms had been pulled in the train's toilet. At about 10 past, while the conductor was speaking with the MC, the driver called the signaller using the radio on the train, the GSMR. He explained the problem, acknowledged that they had a green signal, and the signaller gave the driver permission to continue to try and work the fault from the platform. Shortly afterwards, the conductor passed the phone to the driver to allow them to speak with the maintenance controller. Under the instruction of the maintenance controller, then the driver activated 2 safety isolation switches to get the brakes to release, or to try to get the brakes to release. They were first asked to activate the emergency brake isolation switch, or EBS. This didn't have any effect. The MC then sought authorization from the duty control manager to activate the TIS, one of the more serious safety systems on the train, the traction interlock switch. But again, the driver still couldn't release the train's brakes. These are 2 pretty important safety systems, but they can cause issues if they malfunction. So there are isolation switches in the cab. You are never really wanting to be in a position where you're knocking one of these off, but you can do it. Normally, though, these controls are sealed with a tag that's detailed with when it's been sealed and by who, so they're not erroneously turned off. The maintenance controller then exhausted the checks on the flowchart and suggested that the driver walk through the train to check miniature circuit breakers in the vehicle, which he did, moving to the back of the train, walking through, checking for any passenger alarms that might have been pulled on the way. After this, the driver and conductor decided to try valiantly one more time to overcome the issues. At this crucial moment, 5 of the 6 doors on the train were open, as a number of passengers had alighted and were stood on the platform, and throughout this stop, the conductor and the driver had both been getting on and off the train and using these doors to do so. And this is where things went quite drastically wrong. The driver ran along the platform and returned to the front cab at 15:26. Within the next 30 seconds, they were able to get brake release and apply traction power. Although the conductor was standing on the platform and had not initiated the dispatch process, the driver sent 2 on the buzzer as an acknowledgement to the conductor. That's acknowledgement in air quotes, very much so, which is normally the final step in the train dispatch sequence. And lo and behold, the train then started to move with those 5 body side doors open. The conductor on the platform shouted at the passengers on the platform to stand back from the moving train, running towards the rear cab. Passengers and conductor on the platform observed the 5 doors automatically close as the train departed, and this was due to another safety system which hadn't been isolated, the LSR, the low speed relay. They automatically closed the doors at 3.1 miles an hour. The conductor, somewhat shocked I imagine, alerted the maintenance controller who was still on the phone to him, and they in turn notified the signaller. The signaller stopped the train at the last signal before Manchester Airport, and while stopped at the train, the driver was asked to confirm that all the doors on the train were closed and that the conductor was on board. The driver confirmed this to the signaller, somewhat erroneously on one count, and the train was then signalled to get into Manchester Airport, and when it came to a stand, the doors did not open. When the driver walked down to the rear cab to see why the doors hadn't opened, they found a rear cab sans conductor, unoccupied, with no one there to release the doors. Causal factors here then, a combination of the two. Firstly, that the engineered safeguards built into the unit were bypassed, and secondly, that the train departed in an unsafe condition. And the first one of these gives some other interesting info when you read through it. The fault was known to the engineering team at Northern. They'd first seen it about 10 days earlier, though on depot they weren't able to replicate it and then fix it. Eventually, after this incident and another occurrence in sidings at Stockport following this incident, the fault was isolated. They tracked down what it was. It was an intermittent brake fault affecting only the driving cab of coach 64032, the cab that was being driven from at the time of the accident, the incident. And it was caused by, it's very technical, I don't really understand that much, but intermittent high resistance across a brake supply relay contact, or at least one of 2 emergency relay contacts. At the time of the incident, however, this couldn't be known, and throughout the call with the maintenance controller, the 2 safety systems were allowed to be isolated, and that directly led to the second causal factor, that unsafe condition at the time of departure. The report also highlights that there were rulebook instructions not being followed here. For example, when the interlock is isolated, that traction interlock, doors on both sides of the train must be physically checked to make sure that none of them are open prior to train movement. The driver also has a responsibility to tell the signaller that the train has these systems isolated and they shouldn't move the train without instruction from the signaller. And the correct dispatch process wasn't followed, so the driver would be unaware that the doors were open or not open, because normally the conductor will close the doors and then signal the driver with 2 on the bell buzzer to tell them that this is so, and the driver's going to confirm it with 2 back. In normal service, an interlock light would also illuminate, but clearly with the traction interlock system isolated, this wasn't going to be the case. So this driver really did just, I'm off, buzz, gone. By any reckoning, though, there wasn't really a dispatch process here. The conductor, like I said, wasn't even on the train to operate the doors or to signal the driver. As I've gone on a little bit with this one, and I am conscious of how long this one's going to take to pull together, I'll skip the organisational underlying factors, although they are interesting, do read them, and slide straight into the recommendations. There are 3 here, and unsurprisingly, they're all directed at Northern trains. Firstly, that they should establish a system to provide risk-based guidance regarding decisions to return trains into service with unresolved faults. They should undertake a risk-based review of the operating rules and procedures used to manage safety system isolations, and they should embed non-technical skills training into the ongoing competency monitoring of drivers. Non-technical skills is that's a really interesting one that I think I might just do a section on in one of these episodes at some point. But yeah, it's interesting things that aren't necessarily linked to the role that you are doing, but they're abilities that you need to have alongside it and that you can develop. And that a lot of TOCs and FOCs will do NTS courses, non-technical skills courses, to help people develop those skills. Right, deep breath. That one's boxed off. Let's move on to the next. Okie dokie, the next one here, quite a serious one involving a depot injury. Depots are the unseen part of the network for many passengers, just something that they will pass occasionally as they're travelling along the line, and to them probably look more like just a car park for trains, but these are one of the more dangerous areas for routine work, where you do have people moving around in the same space as trains. And at about 1 PM on the 26th of September last year, a member of Great Western Railway's staff, responsible for shunting trains at St Philip's Marsh Depot in Bristol, was struck by a train that was exiting the shed building. 10 miles an hour the train was travelling at the time of the accident, and after hearing the train strike something, the driver applied the brakes and stopped the train. Others working nearby saw that the shunter was lying next to the train and went to help them, and the shunter, who had sustained serious injuries, was treated by paramedics and then taken to hospital. So, how did this one happen? It's not an overly complicated incident in that respect. A unit required moving from the main shed on the depot, and the shunter went to prepare the unit for the move. They checked the exterior, started the engines, and made sure that the unit built up enough air to operate what needed operating. The shunter then went and stood in front of it to call up and inform the person who was in control of movements on the depot that this train was ready to go. Shortly afterwards, the driver arrived to move the train. They boarded the train and went into the cab. About 10 seconds later, they closed the train's external doors, and during this time, the shunter had moved to the front left side of the train. While there, the shunter gave authority to the driver, who was in the cab window, that movement out of the shed building could begin. About 6 seconds before the train began to move, the driver pulled the track handle away from its off position and moved it back into notch 6 to get the unit moving. As they did this, forward-facing CCTV showed that the shunter had begun walking towards the roller shutter door to exit the shed building. About 3 seconds before the train began to move, the shunter passed through the door to go outside, walking ahead of the train on the left-hand side of the line. And then this is when it goes a bit wrong. Just as the train started to move, the shunter began to walk diagonally to the right-hand side, so they were now in the way of the train's path. They continued walking diagonally until they passed over the right-hand rail, at which point they began walking parallel to the rail but still foul of the train's path, and at this time, the driver was unaware of where the shunter was. About 8 seconds after the train had started to move, the driver moved the traction handle to the off position so it could coast, and at this point the train was travelling at about 10 miles an hour, quickly catching up with the shunter. Within the next second, the train caught up with the shunter. The shunter realised the train was behind them just before it struck them on the elbow. This knocked them over, and as they fell, they threw themselves forward to avoid going underneath the train. They've sustained an ankle injury, and it's not sure whether the ankle was struck by the train or they were injured by throwing themselves forward. The evidence from witnesses indicates that the vest that the shunter was wearing then caught on the side of the train and caused them to be dragged a short distance until the fastenings gave way and the vest fell away. The shunter then came to rest on the apron for the level crossing, lying next to the train. First aid, paramedics, and a trip to the hospital all followed, as I'm sure you can imagine. And the immediate cause of this one then is that the shunter walked into the path of the train, which the driver then started to move and accelerate much quicker than the shunter expected. But the big question is probably why the shunter crossed in front of the train, I suppose, and the reason is split into 4 areas. Firstly, there was a foot crossing ahead of the shed, so if you can picture this, you've got the roller shutter doors, but then the shed building extends a bit further forward on the right, so you have this area where the track is running alongside the shed building, and then at the end of this small section, there is a foot crossing from the back of the shed building over the lines and across it. So contractors were on site at the time, and the shunter wanted to get to the level crossing before the train to stop any contractors who might be approaching it from the blind side of the building, to stop them just walking out and over it. Shunter believed that depot drivers would be aware that walking up to the crossing to check for potential users is something that they did from time to time. However, the driver did state they were unaware that shunters did this and couldn't remember ever having seen a shunter do that. Secondly, then, the shunter used the area between the exit of the main shed building and that level crossing as a walking route, although it was shown as an official walking route on depot maps. The driver didn't believe it was, and GWR have later said that that was shown in error. There were yellow lines painted next to the track that denoted a safe distance from trains, but on the concrete it had faded, and in the area where the shunter was actually hit, it was over drainage grids and the line just wasn't present there. A final key point then in this one is that the shunter wasn't aware that the train was catching up with them. Shunter didn't hear the train start to move behind them, and only became aware of the train as it caught up with them, and by then it was too late to move out of the way, as the shunter was in a place with a limited amount of space. They explained that they expected to reach level crossing before the train did, because this is something they had done before, felt no need to look back. They believed their walking pace meant they would have reached level crossing before the train did, and analysis of the CCTV footage showed the shunter an average speed of about 2.7 miles an hour. When the train began moving, they had about 16 metres more to walk, and that would have taken them about 13 seconds, but the train needed to travel about 30 metres, and the recorded data from the ODTR shows that the train had an average speed of 6.3 miles an hour, meaning that it caught up with them before they reached the crossing. If the train had moved at an average speed of 3 miles an hour, which was typical for a train movement within the shed building, then the shunter would have beaten the train to the level crossing. At 5 miles an hour, they would have met at the same time, and clearly, with this slightly higher speed that the train was moving, it caught up with them. It didn't help the type of train that was being used. It was one with a centre gangway, so people could move between units when they were coupled in multiple, but it did reduce the visibility. So when a person was 8 metres or closer on the right-hand side, they just couldn't be seen from the cab easily. Other factors were identified as part of the investigation around the fact that GWR hadn't effectively controlled the risk of a shunter being struck by a train, and their assurance processes hadn't identified that, well, people were moving trains around faster than the speed limits that were defined on the depot. Right, we are rocketing through this one. 2 recommendations off the back of this incident, and unsurprisingly, both are directed at GWR. Firstly, that they should review the training and assessment they provide for shunters and other staff from their engineering function to gain or rectify their personal track safety competency, and ensure that staff receive an appropriate level of information and assessment about working and walking on depots. Also, that they should review the authorised walking routes and walkways on all their depots where staff hold a personal track safety competency, can walk, and identify the place where staff are using walking routes, which may mean they fall foul of a train's path. With that one out of the way, let's move on and take a look at Britain's favourite kettle, Flying Scotsman. Righto, on the word count side, we're almost at the length of a normal episode now, so I apologise that this one's going to be a little bit longer than normal. On the plus side, this report at 40-ish pages isn't the longest one out there, so we're probably going to be able to have a nice bit of a fly through it. At about 5 minutes past 6 in the evening on the 29th of September last year, the steam locomotive Flying Scotsman, travelling tender first, collided with the Royal Scotsman coaches on the approach to Platform 3 at Aviemore Station on the Strathspey Railway. Videos of this were all over social media at the time, and I'm certain I said a few words about it, caveated with, "We'll wait for the report." Well, here it is. Aviemore Station is the southern terminus of the Strathspey Railway, which is a heritage line, but the station is also located on Network Rail's Highland Main Line in between Perth and Inverness, but Platform 3 is exclusively used for the heritage line. And I apologise if I've butchered any pronunciations with this one. I'm not particularly great when it comes to Scottish and Welsh place names. I do try. To discuss this one quickly then, it's going to be important to make a distinction between the Flying Scotsman and the Royal Scotsman. Flying Scotsman is a former London North Eastern Railway steam loco, currently carrying its BR number 60103. Built in 1923, it was brought off the main line in 1963 and is now currently owned by the National Railway Museum. Flying Scotsman, like most large steam locos, has a tender, which is dragged behind it like a big wagon, just permanently attached and beautifully decorated to match the engine, carrying coal and water for the loco. Royal Scotsman, however, that is a rake of 10 coaches involved in operating the Royal Scotsman luxury rail tours by a company called Belmond. One of the key features of this formation is one of its real draws, and something which actually sets it out from most of the other heritage stock out there. It is the carriage which sits at one end of that rake, number 99965, and it's called the Observation Lounge Car. Largely open internal space with chairs and sofa-style seating, and the leading end of the vehicle, which was impacted by Flying Scotsman in the incident, has a veranda, an observation area. Although it has a roof, it's pretty much open to the environment. It's kind of a balcony at the back of a carriage, if you will. Scotsman had arrived at the Strathspey on the 14th of September, the best day of the year for anyone who cares about my birthday, I have to say, and was undertaking other runnings, promotional photography, bits and bobs, while the Royal Scotsman train was due to arrive on the 29th. All of which happened as planned, and all of which brings us to the situation immediately before the incident, with Scotsman, Royal in the platform, awaiting the coupling of Scotsman, Flying, which was sat at a disused platform a short distance away, known as the Speyside platform. The passengers on board the Royal Scotsman coaches had been informed that the Flying Scotsman would be hauling the train to Boat of Garton. A small number of them gathered on the veranda of the observation lounge car to watch the Scotsman approach and couple. They had been advised against doing so by Belmont staff because of the risk of hot soot from the steam loco. At least one passenger was recording the approach of the Scotsman with a mobile phone, which is a video many of us have now seen. 3 minutes past 6 in the evening then, Scotsman set off driven tender first from the Speyside platform heading south towards Aviemore Station, a epic journey of 344 metres. The Heritage Railways rule book requires that the locomotive drivers obtain the guard's permission before coupling up to a train, and the driver intended to stop short of the Scotsman carriages to seek this permission on arrival at the station. Flying Scotsman's OTDR, not an original fitting, very much a retrofit, showed that the train stayed within the 10 mile an hour maximum permitted speed for the entire journey, and in the last 10 seconds was travelling below 8 miles an hour. Immediately before the collision, the driver looked out of the window on their side of the cab, and as they did so, the custodian's representative, who had their head out of the window on the fireman's side, shouted a warning to the driver, who immediately made a full service application, far too late to prevent the collision, which occurred at about 7 miles an hour. This impact caused at least one person on the veranda to fall to the floor. A passenger standing inside the observation coach also clashed heads with another passenger, causing an injury, and various other minor effects such as spilt bottles of wine and spirits, quite a few of them if you see some of the photos, occurred throughout the train. So the immediate cause of this incident then is that the collision occurred because the driver did not know that the locomotive was in close proximity to the coaches and did not control its speed accordingly. Fair enough, but as ever we will look at the causal factors that lead to that. The physical layout of the track and the configuration of the driving cab on Flying Scotsman contributed to the first causal factor, which was that during the move, the driver's visibility of the coaches was limited because of track curvature and driving position. The driver's position at the locomotive controls is on the left-hand side of the cab when travelling in the normal direction of operation. That's with the chimney leading. The position means that their view of the line in the direction of travel is inherently restricted when reversing around a left-hand curve. It's pretty much about the worst visibility that they've got. From the driver's side of the cab, and should mention in this place they were reversing around a left-hand curve to back onto the carriages. From the driver's side of the cab, then, the end of the coaches closest to the loco first became partially visible when the loco was about 81 metres away from them, but it wasn't until that distance was reduced to about 62 metres that RAIB believed that the presence would be fully apparent to a person looking out of the driver's side of the cab. Conversely, for a person looking out of the fireman's side of the cab, an unimpeded view of the nearest part of the wreck was available for more than 230 metres, which leads nicely into the next factor that should be considered, and probably the more surprising one, that immediately before the collision, no one in the cab warned the driver that the locomotive was approaching the coaches. There was some ambiguity of roles between the 6 people in the cab, which by the way was more than 2 more than the railway's rules allowed for, with many believing that the locomotive's custodian's representative was in control of the move, which wasn't particularly helped by the fact that they were sat in the fireman's seat while the fireman tended the fire, and this was the position that provided the best view of the coaches on the approach. Witness evidence indicates that these actions created a perception among the other people in the cab that that person, the custodian's representative, was observing the movement and providing directions to the driver. However, the custodian's representative stated that they did not consider that they were undertaking that role, and in fact, immediately before the collision, they did realise that the loco was about to collide with the coaches and shouted a warning. But in all fairness, at this point, the driver had just moved to look out of their side and had also seen the coaches coming into view. 2 other identified factors were that the driver had expected the coaches to be positioned further along the platform, but this wasn't the case on the day in question for various reasons, which the report does go into, and also that there had been no briefing or plan for the movement which was being undertaken. In hindsight, there probably should have been. Recommendations then for the kettle collision, as I'm going to call this one, but surely it will not catch on. Only the one in this case, and it goes to the Strathspey Railway Company, that they should review the implementation of its new standard operating procedure to manage special events and special train planning to ensure that it is effectively identifying, assessing and mitigating the risks associated with such events. On to the last report, and you could be forgiven for feeling a sense of deja vu as we talk about an overspeed incident at Spittal Junction, Peterborough. At around 1300 hours on the 4th of May last year, the 954 Sunderland to London King's Cross passed over 3 sets of points, forming part of Spittal Junction at excessive speed. The maximum permitted speed over the junction is 30 miles an hour, reducing to 25, and the data from the train indicated that they'd been traversed at 66 miles an hour. This resulted in some sudden sideways movement of the coaches, leading to passengers being thrown from their seats, with some receiving minor injuries. Now, if this sounds familiar, it should. This is almost the exact situation as Lumo experienced in April of 2022, about 13 months before. And as with that incident, this train was not due to call at Peterborough and was travelling on the up fast line before reaching the junction's protecting signal on the approach to Spittal Junction. At the time of the overspeed, Papa 468, which is the signal in question, was indicating that the route was set for a diverging route, directing the train to the up slow line via platform 1 and not directly through the up fast and platform 3. The driver didn't observe this junction indicator and reacted only to the main aspect of the signal by applying full power to the train when it had changed from a red aspect to a green. Due to the similarities, I'm probably not going to labour on this one as we have already spoken about Lumo's indiscretions in the same location, but we'll just skip straight to factors. Immediate cause, of course, being that the train passed over the junction at excessive speed because the driver had controlled the speed inappropriately, being that it was for the through route rather than the slower diverging route. Causal factors then, primarily that the driver had not appropriately reacted to the junction indication due to a number of other factors. First and foremost being, as was with the previous one, that they had formed an expectation that the train would be routed straight ahead. Now, this driver was aware of how this signal functioned, what the junction indications meant. They were aware of the previous instant at it and the risk that this presented. However, in this instance, their prior experiences and the information they had been presented with on their approach to the signal just convinced them that the train was being routed straight ahead. And this again bears similarity to the previous incident. It was identified that the advanced warnings provided as part of the signalling system, so that would be flashing aspects to indicate a diverging route and automatic warning systems being set off for the speed restriction, were ineffective as a warning of this diverging route. Now, I think we talked about this last time, but Papa 468 is configured to be approach released from yellow with flashing aspects for the diverging route to the up slow line. So that means that the two signals on the approach can show double flashing yellow aspects and a single flashing aspect, respectively, when a diverging route has been set to the up slow line. This gives drivers advanced warning that the route is set for the divergence so that train speed can be controlled as it approaches the junction. Now, in other locations, this works really well as an additional warning, as well as controlling the speed of the train down if required for reduced speed on the diverging routes. However, displaying these flashing yellow aspects is conditional on the location of the train approaching the signals and the status of the route beyond the signal. So in this situation, because 1 Alpha 64, the train that was involved in the incident, was close to Papa 468, and because the route beyond the signal had not been set at the time the train was approaching, this signalling wouldn't have shown the flashing yellow aspects. It was inhibited. It was then configured to be approach released from red, and when a signal is approach released from red, that means it will show a red aspect to slow the train down, but at the point the train gets close enough to be in close approach, the signal will step up to a proceed aspect, which in this case was green. Green with a junction indication. So the indication was there for the driver that they were supposed to be taking this route. Their route knowledge would be the thing that told them that they needed to be travelling at 30, then dropping to 25 to make their way over these points. But, yeah, because there was a train leaving Peterborough ahead of them, the route couldn't be set, which would have triggered the flashing yellows. If they had seen them, this would have given them a different signalling sequence to what was normally seen, as opposed to red stepping up to green. And this would likely have challenged the expectation of being routed onto the up fast and helped it click for them that they were being routed onto the up slow. Anyway, circling back round to causes present in the previous Lumo incident, we do see the return of some classics. The driver only reacted to the main aspect and did not actively check for the junction indication, and that's how conspicuous the junction signals indicator was. They raised that as a concern that its level of association with the main aspect may have reduced the likelihood of the driver observing it. I'm just reading that out to you. It's a really interesting part of the report, and you should read it. It goes into some really quite detailed analysis of different light beams and so on, where the cone of each beam is in relation to trains at certain distances. To be honest with you, it's one of those situations where I feel like it works best pictorially. An audio format can only do so much with some of this stuff. So if you like the technical detail, if you want to really understand something, I will point you over. But I'm going to slide over trying to actually explain it. Because all I do, you won't see this, is I stand here and I mime things out of my hands. I draw circles. I might air draw track layouts while I'm talking about them on an audio format. You'll never see that. That's just for me, I guess. But yeah, this section of the report is really interesting, but it's definitely a read it and look at the diagrams. In the report, anyway, then they also revisit the fact that the distance between the signal and the point work provides an opportunity to accelerate to quite a decent clip. So if you have misinterpreted where you're being routed, from the point where that signal steps up from a red to a green, you've got the opportunity to get your train up to quite high speeds before you hit the points. We talked about this with Lumos, the acceleration of the Hitachi that Lumo was using. That got them up to, I believe it was about 80 miles an hour in quite a small period of time. And even though the Hitachis do perform a little bit better than the older 180s that Grand Central has, they still managed to get up to a decent speed. Skipping through this one then to wrap us up, not a little bit too longer than normal. There are recommendations to both Grand Central and Network Rail about issues that we've seen replicated as well. But firstly to Grand Central then, they should review and amend as necessary their training and competence management processes to provide all their drivers with the necessary skills and strategies to manage the risk encountered at signals which may show different aspects to those usually encountered. Network Rail is told that working with transport undertakings using its infrastructure, they should review the processes by which they identify, share and implement safety learning from accidents that involve risks that need to be managed by more than one party, which is key considering that another incident took place in the 13-month period before this one. The Rail Safety and Standards Board receives a recommendation that they should review the specifications for the, and we'll take a deep breath before this one, for the procurement of signal aspects stated within Rail Industry Standard RIS-0737-CCS and Railway Group Standard GKRT0057. Left the standards in because I've missed any out this episode, and you know I love a catchy title. Finally, Network Rail is recommended to review its current arrangements for maintenance and replacement of LED indicators used for signalling purposes, considering the expected degradation in performance that is predicted to occur over time. And I am abundantly aware, looking at the length of this episode, that I have actually rocketed through some of those last ones. Not necessarily intentionally. It's just been a case that I didn't know how long my throat was going to hold out, so I had to get it down because if I didn't finish it tonight, it wasn't going out. That gets us through the pile of new reports, Safety Digest, and news stories, and I know that another Safety Digest has just dropped in as I'm recording this for the Craven Arms one. That's going to wait till the next time we do a roundup episode. It's time for us to move on and do some proper episodes again, mix them up as we did before. Right. All of which brings us to the end of our rail safety review for this week. Thank you so much for coming to join me as we look at the most current of affairs in railway safety. All that it remains for me to say as part of the proper episode this time is I don't really dedicate these things ever. I never have. But as I mentioned at the start of the episode, it's been a really grim week. And one of the things that happened in my house was we very suddenly lost one of our cats. And I've never lost a pet before. And I really, really don't like it. So I've had a terrible week. And the rest of my family has had a terrible week as well, including our 5-year-old daughter who understands death and grief now. So thank you very much for those of you on Twitter who've said very kind things and given support, because it has been enormously appreciated. Right. And that's that. Come and hang out with me in the virtual world of social media and join the conversation. You can find me on Twitter or Facebook. Just search for Signals to Danger. If email is your scene, you can also get me at daniel.fox@dfrailmedia.com. As ever, there are some other ways you can support the podcast through Patreon or merchandise. Head on over to signalstodanger.com. Support for more info. And remember, Patreon subscribers can listen to these episodes advert-free. That is it from me. And once again, until the next time you hear my voice, travel safe.